July 9, 1944. The northern tip of Saipan. The air above Marpi Point is thick, a suffocating mixture of salt spray, the metallic tang of spent brass, and the sweet, cloying scent of tropical decay. Below the limestone cliffs, the Philippine Sea churns in a violent shade of indigo, shattering against the jagged rocks where the tide runs red. There is a sound here that defies the natural order. Not just the rhythmic boom of the surf or the distant, rolling thunder of American naval guns, but the high-pitched, desperate wail of wind rushing through the jagged caves. Inside one such limestone hollow, the darkness is absolute, save for the rhythmic flicker of a single dying oil lamp. Here, the silence is heavy, broken only by the shallow, ragged breathing of 20 young women huddled against the damp stone. They are the nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army, their white uniforms now a ghost gray, stained with the soil of a lost empire and the lifeblood of men they could not save. They wait for the end, clutching small ceramic grenades to their chests, waiting for the demons they were told would come to devour them. They have been told that to be captured by the Americans is a fate worse than the extinction of the soul. They have been told that the enemy is a barbarian who knows no mercy, a beast that thrives on cruelty. But as the first light of dawn filters through the cave entrance, casting long, trembling shadows against the stalactites, the reality that is about to descend upon them will do more than shatter their fear. It will dismantle the very foundations of the world they were raised to believe in. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had become a grinding machine of attrition, a collision between two irreconcilable philosophies. On one side stood the Empire of Japan, a society mobilized under the banner of Saipan, spiritual strength. To the Japanese high command, the lack of steel, oil, and food was a secondary concern. The ultimate weapon was the willingness of the Japanese subject to perish for the emperor. This was the era of Gyokusai, the shattered jewel, where honorable suicide was preferred over the perceived shame of surrender. For the women serving in the medical corps, many of them mere teenagers recruited from high schools in Okinawa and the home islands, the indoctrination was total. They were the daughters of a nation that viewed the world through the lens of scarcity and divine sacrifice. To them, the United States was a decadent, fractured society, a collection of soft individuals who lacked the Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit. They believed that while America had machines, Japan had a soul that could never be broken. They were prepared to die in the mud of Saipan, convinced that the Americans were coming to rape, torture, and kill. This was the psychological landscape of the Pacific, a war of extermination fueled by a propaganda machine that painted the American GI not as a man, but as a kichiku, a devil beast. The reality of the Japanese logistical situation was, however, catastrophic. As the American submarine blockade tightened its noose around the islands, the flow of supplies dried to a trickle. Japanese soldiers and nurses were surviving on handfuls of moldy rice and the occasional piece of dried fish. Scurvy and beriberi were as much an enemy as the M1 Garand. The medical kits of these nurses were empty. Their bandages were reused until they were stiff with dried infection, and their only anesthetic was the instruction to endure. In their minds, this suffering was noble. They assumed the Americans, too, must be struggling, that the entire world was caught in a desperate scramble for the crumbs of existence. They could not conceive of a nation that could wage total war while maintaining a standard of living that surpassed their own peacetime dreams. They expected a hungry, desperate enemy. What they found instead was an industrial titan that had turned the very act of logistics into a weapon of psychological warfare. When the American 27th Infantry Division finally reached the caves of Marpi Point, the expected massacre did not occur. Instead of the bayonet, the nurses were met with a confusing, overwhelming display of order. They were led, trembling and weeping, to a field hospital established in the shade of a charred banyan tree. It was here that the transformation began. It started not with words, for the language barrier was a chasm, but with a single recurring symbolic object that would come to define their captivity: the American care package. To a Japanese nurse who had spent months rationing a single bowl of watery gruel, the sight of a standard Red Cross parcel or a K-ration box was not just food, it was a sensory hallucination. They watched as American orderlies, men they had been told were monsters, began to tear open cardboard boxes with a casual indifference to their value. The symbolic weight of the care package cannot be overstated. In the eyes of the Japanese prisoners, these boxes represented the American abundance, a concept that felt like a direct assault on their ideology of spiritual superiority. The most profound of these symbols was the tin of canned peaches. To the Japanese, sugar was a luxury of the highest order, a rarity reserved for the elite or for the final meal of a kamikaze pilot. Yet, here were American soldiers, dusty and blood-stained, cracking open tins of golden, syrupy peaches as if they were water. The sound of the can opener, a rhythmic, mechanical snip-snip-snip, became the heartbeat of their new reality. When the first nurse was offered a slice of this fruit, she hesitated, certain it was poisoned. She had been taught that the Americans would use any trick to break their will. But when she finally tasted the heavy, concentrated sweetness, the golden syrup coating a tongue that had known only salt and dust for a year, the tears began to flow. It was a physical shock to the system. This was too much. How could a nation afford to send such delicacies to the front lines? How could an army be so well supplied that they gave their prisoners the very things the Japanese people back home were starving for? The historical records of the time, including the diaries of captured medical personnel and the reports of the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Branch, detail this moment of logistical shock with clinical precision. In one recorded interrogation, a captured Japanese nurse named Fumiko expressed a sentiment that was echoed across the Pacific. "We were told that America was a land of luxury and weakness, but we did not understand what that meant until we saw your garbage. You throw away more meat in one day than our village sees in a month." The data backed her observation. By 1944, the United States was producing over 600,000 tons of canned fruit per year specifically for military consumption. The Red Cross Standard Package No. 9, which began to arrive in the hands of these stunned women, contained things that defied their understanding of wartime reality. 4 packages of cigarettes, a pound of sugar, a tin of processed ham, bars of chocolate, and real coffee. To the Japanese mind, conditioned by the National General Mobilization Law, which had stripped the Japanese home islands of even the metal buttons on their coats, this was not just a meal. It was evidence of a productive capacity that made the Japanese effort look like a medieval crusade fighting a modern industrial empire. As the days turned into weeks in the internment camps and field hospitals, the care package continued its work of subversion. The nurses watched as American transport planes darkened the sky, dropping parachutes laden with more crates. They saw the Duku amphibious trucks rolling onto the beaches, filled to the brim with white flour and medical supplies. They witnessed American doctors using sulfonamide powders and penicillin, medicines the Japanese had only heard of in whispers, to treat not just their own wounded, but the Japanese prisoners as well. The ideological foundation of spiritual strength began to crumble under the weight of this material reality. If Japan was divinely protected, why were its children starving while the demons had chocolate? The nurses began to realize that the Kichiku were not monsters, but men who belonged to a system that valued the individual's survival and comfort. The abundance of the American care package was the ultimate proof of democracy's power. It was the result of a free labor force and a continent-sized factory that could provide both guns and butter. The transformation of these women was profound. They had entered the caves as subjects of a death cult, prepared to take their own lives to preserve a hollow honor. They emerged as witnesses to a different way of life. They began to observe the casual nature of the American soldiers, how they spoke to their officers with a lack of the groveling subservience required in the IJA, how they shared their rations with the local children, and how they seemed more interested in going home than in dying for a cause. The recurring sound of the American camp, the clinking of metal mess kits and the whistling of jazz tunes, became a soundtrack to their re-education. The nurses, who had been taught that Westerners were soft, began to see that this softness was actually a form of resilience born from a lack of desperation. A soldier who is well fed and knows his family is safe is a soldier who can afford to be human. The too muchness of the American supply chain became a recurring theme in their testimonies. They wrote home, when they were finally allowed, about the miracle of the boxes. They described the texture of the white bread, which they called cloud cake, because it was so much softer than the hard, grit-filled barley they were used to. They spoke of the magic powder, instant coffee, that could turn hot water into a rich, dark drink. But beneath the wonder of the food was a deeper, more unsettling realization. They had been lied to. The emperor was not a god who could provide. He was a man who had led them into a void. The spiritual strength they had been promised was a shroud, while the decadent materialism of the Americans was actually a shield. This was the moment the war was truly won, not on the battlefields of Iwo Jima or through the horror of the atomic bomb, but in the quiet moments when a terrified Japanese nurse realized that her enemy cared more for her health than her own commanders did. The symbolism of the care package extended beyond the stomach. It represented a society that could organize its vast resources to care for the other. In the Japanese military, a wounded soldier was often seen as a burden, a broken tool. In the American system, a prisoner was a responsibility. This contrast was the most devastating weapon in the U.S. arsenal. The nurses began to volunteer in the American wards, their skilled hands now working alongside the very men they had been told would kill them. They saw the golden peach, that recurring symbol of sweetness and abundance, being fed to dying Japanese soldiers by American corpsmen. It was a subversion of every law of war they had ever known. The sweetness of the syrup was the taste of a future they had never been allowed to imagine, a future where life was not defined by the beauty of a falling cherry blossom, a metaphor for a short, sacrificial life, but by the steady, reliable hum of a factory and the safety of a full pantry. By the end of the conflict, as the first groups of these nurses were repatriated to a burnt-out Japan, they carried with them more than just the memories of the war. They carried a new understanding of what a nation could be. They had seen the American care package and understood it for what it truly was, a manifestation of a world where the individual was worth more than the state's pride. They had been stunned by the too muchness, but in that excess they found the room to breathe, to think, and to survive. They returned to their ruins not as defeated soldiers, but as the first citizens of a new Japan, one that would eventually trade its swords for the very industrial might they had once feared. In the quiet hush of history, we often look to the grand maneuvers of generals and the fire of great batteries to understand the turning of the tide. But perhaps the true collapse of the old world happened in the palm of a girl's hand, in the simple, overwhelming weight of a tin of fruit. The American care package was more than a gesture of charity. It was a silent, irresistible argument for the dignity of life. It showed that the strength of a civilization is measured not by how many it can kill in the name of a god, but by how many it can feed in the name of a neighbor. Those nurses, once huddled in the dark of Saipan's caves, learned a truth that survives long after the smoke of the Pacific has cleared, that when freedom meets desperation, it does not come with a sword, but with an open hand. In the end, the abundance that stunned them was not just of food, but of hope, a sweetness that, once tasted, made the bitterness of tyranny impossible to swallow ever again. The legacy of those packages remains a testament to a simple, poetic truth, that the most powerful weapon in the defense of liberty is the unapologetic provision of human care, proving that even in the darkest theater of war, the light of mercy is the only thing that can truly conquer the heart. The cliffs of Marpi Point still stand, weathered by the same indigo tides, but the ghosts of 1944 have been replaced by the quiet rustle of the wind. If one listens closely, beyond the crashing surf, One can almost hear the rhythmic snip of a tin opener and the soft, startled sob of a young woman discovering that the world is much larger and much kinder than she had been told. The too much was never about the sugar or the meat. It was about the realization that every human being deserves a seat at the table of the living. And in that realization, the seeds of a new, peaceful Pacific were sown, watered by the syrup of a golden peach and the tears of those who finally understood that to be captured by the truth is the only way to be truly free. The story of the Japanese nurses and the American care packages serves as a profound historical mirror, reflecting the stark divide between a culture of scarcity and a culture of surplus. In the modern era, we often take for granted the logistical miracles that allow for global relief, but in 1944, this was a revolutionary concept. The logistics of democracy was a phrase coined by historians to describe how the U.S. turned its domestic industry into a global lifeline. For the nurses, this was not a textbook theory. It was a visceral, life-altering experience. They saw that the American GI was not just a fighter, but a representative of a system that produced in such staggering volumes that it could afford to be compassionate. This was the arsenal of democracy in its most intimate form, not the B-29 bomber, but the chocolate bar. As we reflect on these events, we see the transformation of the Japanese psyche from one of imperial subservience to one of democratic potential. The nurses were the vanguards of this change. When they returned to Japan, they did not bring back stories of American cruelty, but stories of American too-muchness. They spoke of the mountains of supplies, the endless crates of medicine, and the strange, wonderful kindness of the demons. They became the silent architects of the post-war miracle, understanding that a nation's greatness is built on the well-being of its people. The recurring symbol of the canned peach, golden and resilient, remains a metaphor for that transition, a transition from the darkness of the cave to the light of a new, abundant world. The final truth of Saipan and the care packages is a poetic one. It suggests that while wars are fought with steel, they are won with the soul. The Japanese had the soul of sacrifice, but the Americans had the soul of provision. In the collision of these two, the soul of provision proved more enduring. It proved that a society that values the too much for its citizens will always outlast a society that demands the too little for its subjects. The nurses who were stunned by American care packages were not just witnesses to a military victory. They were the first beneficiaries of a moral one. And in their survival, we find the ultimate justification for the abundance of freedom, a sweetness that endures, a care that never ceases, and a truth that, once known, can never be forgotten. The silence of the Pacific is now a peaceful one, but the echoes of those opened boxes remain. They tell us that in the face of total war, the most radical act is not to kill, but to nourish. The Japanese nurses, once prepared for death, were given life by the very people they feared. This is the enduring lesson of the care package, that even in the height of a global cataclysm, a single act of abundance can shatter 1,000 years of indoctrination. The too-muchness of American care was the greatest gift the nurses ever received, for it gave them back their humanity, and in doing so, it changed the course of history forever. As the sun sets over the Philippine Sea, the golden light catches the water in a way that recalls the syrup of those long-ago peaches. It is a reminder that the world can be sweet, that mercy is possible, and that even the most indoctrinated heart can be opened by the simple weight of a gift. The nurses of Saipan are gone now, but their story lives on, a story of how a nation's abundance became a bridge to peace, and how the too much of American care was exactly what was needed to heal a broken world. In the end, the care package was not just food for the body, but fuel for the rebirth of a nation, a symbol of a democracy that, at its best, seeks to replace the hunger of war with the fullness of freedom. This narrative arc, from the terror of the caves to the stunned silence of the camp hospital, encapsulates the entire Pacific experience. It shows the collapse of the Bushido Code not through defeat on the battlefield, but through the overwhelming evidence of a superior way of life. The nurses were not conquered by soldiers. They were conquered by the American farmer, the American factory worker, and the American volunteer. They were conquered by the sheer, undeniable reality that a free people could produce more, care more, and live more than those bound by the chains of a militaristic state. This is the poetic reflection of the WW2 tales, a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies in its ability to provide, and that the ultimate victory is not the destruction of the enemy, but their transformation into a friend through the power of a care package and the sweetness of a golden peach. The legacy of these women is found in the modern Japan we see today, a nation of health, prosperity, and peace. They were the ones who saw the truth first. They were the ones who tasted the future in a tin of fruit and realized that the demons were actually their liberators. Their story is a testament to the power of logistics, the impact of kindness, and the enduring truth that abundance is the greatest advocate for democracy. In the long narration of World War II, let us not forget the small boxes that did more to win the peace than the largest bombs. Let us remember the too muchness that saved a generation of women and, through them, helped to save a nation from its own darkness. The sound of the surf at Marpi Point is no longer a wail of despair, but a whisper of a promise kept, the promise that even in the depths of war, the human spirit can be reached, fed, and redeemed by the simple, overwhelming power of enough. The transition from the old world to the new was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, syrupy drip of realization. It was the feeling of a clean bandage on a festering wound. It was the smell of real tobacco after months of smoking dried leaves. It was the sight of a GI sharing his chocolate with a child. These were the moments that defined the American occupation and the subsequent alliance. The too muchness became the standard, the goal toward which a new Japan would strive. And as we look back on those nurses, stunned by the care they received, we see the beginning of a story that is still being written, a story of how the abundance of one nation can become the hope of another, and how, in the end, the sweetest victory of all is the one that leaves no one hungry. In the final accounting of the war, the statistics of tonnage and casualties will always be recorded, but the weight of the American care package in the hand of a starving nurse is a measure that defies calculation. It is the weight of humanity itself, reasserting its presence in a world gone mad. It is the poetic truth that links the struggle of the 1940s to our own time, that freedom is not just an idea, but a lived experience, one that is best expressed through the act of caring for those who have nothing. The Japanese nurses of Saipan, once lost in the shadows, found their way back to the light through the simple, overwhelming abundance of a nation that chose to give rather than to just take. And in that choice, the world was forever changed. The too muchness of America remains its most enduring characteristic, a double-edged sword that can overwhelm or uplift. But in the context of 1944, for 20 young women in a cave, it was the only thing that mattered. It was the too much that was just enough to save them. As the documentary ends and the screen fades to black, the image that remains is not one of a weapon, but of a golden peach in a silver tin, a symbol of a democracy that, even in the fire of war, never forgot the power of a sweet, syrupy mercy. This is the truth of the Pacific, the truth of the care package, and the truth of a freedom that feeds the soul as much as the body. It is a story of how a nation's abundance became a bridge across the abyss of war, proving that even the most bitter enemies can be reunited by the simple, universal language of a well-filled box and a heart that chooses to care. The story concludes not with the silence of the grave, but with the bustling sounds of a rebuilt Tokyo, a testament to the fact that those nurses took the lessons of the care package home. They taught their children that the world was not a place of scarcity and death, but a place of potential and life. The too much became the just right for a new generation. And so, the care packages of 1944 continue to deliver their contents, decades later, in the form of a lasting peace and a shared prosperity that began with a stunned silence in a cave and the taste of a golden fruit that was, quite simply, too much to believe, yet too real to deny. This is the ultimate victory of the American care package. Not that it fed the hungry, but that it fed the hope of a world that had forgotten what it was to be full. In that fullness, we find the enduring legacy of World War II, a legacy of abundance, a legacy of care, and a legacy of a freedom that, once tasted, can never be surrendered. July 1944 remains a marker in time, a moment when the steel of war met the sweetness of peace. The nurses of Saipan are the quiet witnesses to this miracle. Their stories a reminder that the most powerful thing a nation can do is to be too much for its enemies in the most compassionate of ways. Their transformation is our transformation, a reminder to always look for the golden peach in the midst of the limestone caves of our own lives, and to remember that the greatest care we can give is the care that stuns the heart with its unexpected, overwhelming abundance. In the end, the care package was the message, and the message was simple. You are not forgotten, you are not a monster, and there is more than enough for us all to survive. This is the cinematic truth of the Pacific, a long-form narrative of grace that continues to ripple through the decades, reminding us that the best way to defeat a demon is to offer it a seat at your table. The story of the Japanese nurses and the American care packages is, finally, a story of the triumph of the human heart over the machinery of hate, a story that begins with a box and ends with a world reborn in the sweet, syrupy light of a new and lasting dawn.